Recently, we did a video about some really cool ice bases, and the intention was to try and spread some cool vibes and bring the overall temperature down. But that unfortunately doesn't seem to have worked, and it's still remaining hot. So we're going to be pushing even further and try to bring us down to a cool place by painting up some space walls. For this project, we are going to be doing a small conversion on the model. We're going to be using an assault intercessor as the base. However, we want this to feel a little bit different to the standard build. So we can jump into our parts bin, dig out some suitable options, and we ended up deciding on a combat knife being swapped in place of the chainsaw. For this, we can use a craft knife to cut off the chainsaw blade from the hand, as well as the combat knife blade, and then we need to swap these around and glue them into place. The only real other amendment we made to building this is we kept the head and the backpack separate, just to allow easier access for painting. Talking about painting, we are naturally going to be painting a space wolf, as I mentioned. But we also recently picked up some scale 75 paints, so why not take a better opportunity to use some of the scale 75 paints? But we're pushing it a little bit further than that. We're actually only going to be using a limited palette for this, which means a total of 5 paints for the majority of this model. On top of this, I also want to try something slightly different, and that is to change up the style to get a little bit more dramatic lighting on my overall model. So having some point source lights and things like that. That means that the overall blends and things like that can be a little bit less detailed and a little bit less quality than normal, because the actual thing that I'm focusing on is getting the right placement of that light. Though naturally it'd be good if the blends also looked good as well. We are going to be working from a white to black zenithal as normal, but more importantly, we mentioned earlier we're using a limited palette of colors. Starting with all of the armor panels, we can take our mid blue and then use this to base coat all of the armor sections. This will give us an underlying tone that we can start to work on. Our next steps are going to involve blocking out the base areas on all of the other sections that we want to paint in all of the other colors, which is going to allow us to gauge the placement and the ratio of the overall colors that we're using. We can use the black gray for all of the recesses, as well as any of the general areas that are going to need to be black or metal. Similar to all of the remaining areas, we're going to go around with the red brown and apply this as a nice coat over all of the remaining areas so that we have a nice spread of darker tones across the model. It's probably worth pointing out that if you're doing this yourself, you don't necessarily need to paint all of the other areas in stage 2. You could paint all of the armor to completion and then paint the rest of the areas. For me, I'm going into this without an overall plan. I've got the overall desired outcome that I'm kind of thinking I'm looking for, as well as having a limited palette, which kind of makes the decision of what paints to use already decided. So for me, I'm kind of going in and judging it as I go, which is why we're doing it at this point to judge and base all the ratios. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but equally, if you do want to, it's also a way of doing it. So I just thought I'd point that out. If you want to just focus on the armor and then do the red or things like that after the fact, just do it that way. We are going to start by painting in the shadows. To do this, we can mix our dark grey black into our base coat blue in order to make a darker version of that colour. And then we can start to paint. We are aiming for a 2 light source paint job on this model, with the first light source being roughly 45 degrees to the left of the front centre model, while the other will be roughly the same 45 degrees, however, from the right rear end of the model. This means that most of the light will come on from one side, giving us a nice distinct shadow area. With this giving us an overall light pattern across the top and upward facing elements of the models, we have a nice area where any downward facing sections directly away from the light sources we've picked out can be darkened. So what we're going to do is take our colour that we've just mixed up and apply this as our first shadow matte. We can then come back and darken down the shadows, which will involve mixing a little bit more of our dark colour into the last mix, and then using this to trace in the deepest, darkest shadows. We can then pop back to a mix similar to our first shadow, and then essentially use this to do a little bit of blending between our mid-tone and the darkest shadow that we have applied. When we're doing this, we need to remember the shape of the item that we're painting and where the light's coming from, and then how those two things would interact. Obviously, if you've got a square or a cube, that's going to react differently to an overall sphere or other type of plane. And with that said, that is slightly different to how I tend to paint a lot of my standard models. I tend to go for a sort of overall scheme, give everything a nice edge highlight, put in a lot of separation so you can see the details, but overall, we haven't got dramatic shading and lighting. Where we're doing dramatic shading and lighting on this one, we need to make sure that it does correctly follow how the shapes would interact, otherwise it's going to look completely wrong. And that's why we're doing this video. We're going to be trying to get better at doing that. So let's carry on with painting in those shadows and those lights. With our shadows mapped out, we can start to build up some of the brighter areas facing towards our light source. This is going to be where we mix our base blue and the paler bright blue from our collection of paints. Starting with only a little bit of the pale blue in the mix, we are going to start to map out the brighter areas. As a space wolf, we want the mid-tone to be this brighter, paler blue, similar to the Games Workshop box art. At this point, we should have nice overall colour placement, and it should start to be taking shape as to where the lighter sections can be versus the darker shadows. Moving to thinner highlights for this round, we're coming to attack this in the pure pale blue. A thin application of this is going to be applied over all of the edges of all of the panels and sections on any of the sides which are facing up and where the light would impact. While any of the areas that are in the shadow side are only going to receive the thinnest edge highlight or potentially just a spot highlight. This last step will hopefully give us some nice detail and separation, all of the edge highlights splitting out the panels nicely. But we are going to want to go a little bit further with our highlights. And we're going to be doing that by taking our pale blue that we've used so far and mixing in a small amount of our sandy bone highlight. This will give us a slightly warmer, brighter highlight to work from, and we can come in and do some very edge and very spot highlighting. This new mix can be used as an ultra thin edge highlight or spot highlight on all of the brightest sections of armour. Remember, we are basing the brightest points on where we would expect the light to reflect back most from our preferred angle. This means rotating and checking the viewing angles regularly to make sure that we've got the items in the right area and that they read correctly. Those highlights finish off the armour, which to be honest I think is mainly the section that people are interested in on the Space Wolves, but we are naturally going to paint the few other areas before we spin across to the trim. These are going to be painted up in very similar ways. Obviously we're going to be mixing various highlights and shadows from the colours that we've got, but the way that we're going to be trying to build in some variation and difference is the way we're highlighting. So when we're coming in and doing things like fabrics and leathers, we can do a scratchier, broader highlight versus things like metals, which can have relatively thin and sharp highlights. Starting off with all of our silver elements. Here, that is sections of the gun, the knife, as well as some smaller elements like the belt buckle, the chest emblem, and the vents on the backpack. These were naturally painted in our black grey earlier, so now what we're going to do is come in and start to highlight with a mix of our dark base colour as well as our brighter sand. We can do this over a couple of coats, narrowing the application each time as we add a little bit more of our sand highlight colour. This will need to be finished off with a very fine spot highlight of our sandy bone, catching the sharpest edge facing towards our light source. With all this work done, we can then optionally come back with a thinned black grey and then use this to blend all the layers and reinforce any of the darkest shadow areas. We can then essentially recreate these steps, but this time we're going to be tackling the leathers. These were based in our red-brown to start with, and for a highlight what we're going to be doing is sapping some of the saturation out of our colour by mixing in a little bit of our light blue. This will lighten and desaturate the brown, which means we're able to apply a couple of thin layers, adding in more blue as we go, giving us a slowly worn and cool highlight on all of the fabrics and leathers. Now, we do have the trim and the gun, and we're going to be focusing more on the trim here than we are on the gun, and the reason for that is because the trim's part of the armour, which I think is kind of more important for the Space Wolves. You can paint a gun however you want. But also, the gun was painted using the same ratios and things as our trim, except we just used a tiny bit less of the pale blue in the mix to give us a bit of a difference between the two elements. Talking of our trim, the base coat covered our trim in the brown. What we're going to do is layer that up by mixing a little bit of sand into that brown, and then using this as essentially a re-base coat. This is going to be a slightly brighter tone than what is on the model so far, and already applied over the trim. Then it's a case of applying a few coats, but as before, adding a little bit of the sand highlight as we go. Similar to the dark metals, this will add a little bit of warmth, and we can go around highlighting with thinner and thinner layers and highlight passes until we finish off with a thin and pure sand highlight. At this point, it's just a case of painting the head in whatever skin tone that you choose to use. Naturally, we used a mix of the colours in our limited palette in order to mix up a skin tone and a hair colour, and painted it using that. You can add a little bit of variety if you don't want to use a limited palette. I do need to point out we did actually add one additional colour. We went and dug out a very bright tealy green, and then used that to basically paint anything like lenses, light, as well as purity seals. I wanted these areas to have difference to the rest of the area, so they kind of stood out. But equally, I didn't want them to be too bold and punchy by coming in with a bright red. So I felt like a slightly jadier, greenier version of the blues that we were using was a nice balance and won't draw too much attention, but be a nice little feature. As you can hopefully see, I like this model and how it came out. I think that from the main light angles, which is what we were focusing on in this video, it looks very much like a Space Wolf. But then if you turn it to the 45-degree off angle, where we've painted in all of the shadows, you can see a distinct colour and contrast and hue difference where it is a lot darker, which I like and was the effect that I was going for. Yes, the blends could be slightly neater, but equally, this wasn't a video or a project about improving my blending. It was a video about doing more dramatic light sourcing, and then I can work on the blending once I've got the placement down. Naturally, we needed a nice base to sort this guy out, so I ended up using one of the ice bases that we painted recently. And that's quite convenient because it's got a dark center and we've gone for some dark shadow, so it kind of makes sense. If we put him on an entirely white ice base, there wouldn't necessarily have been dark shadows because they would have been reflecting the white, so it would have been slightly harder to do. Naturally, if you want bases to put your models on and you've already seen the ice bases that we made last week, what I can actually suggest is checking out this playlist here, because that's the playlist where we make lots of different types of bases and they're all generally quite easy and quick to do. Otherwise, if you don't have time for that, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.